Good afternoon. Welcome to the first in our series of Research Without Borders this academic year. I hope you're all picking up or sitting on the list of other sessions. We've got a really exciting program scheduled for this semester and next semester. My name is Patricia Renfro. I'm the Deputy University Librarian, and I'm very pleased to introduce this session on the promise of peer review. We hear lots of comments and questions about peer review throughout academia. Does today's networked environment offer new and better ways to ensure the quality of published scholarship? Is open peer review desirable? What's the quality of the peer reviews themselves? How useful are reviews to the authors? And I think also interesting, how do we find out how effective the peer review system is, since it's mostly under wraps and spread across this very wide range of disciplines. So we have three speakers today. Our main speaker, and I'll introduce all three of them right now. Our main speaker is Vivian Siegel. Vivian is the Research Professor of Medicine and Cell and Developmental Biology at Vanderbilt University, where she directs the Center for Science Communication. She's currently the executive editor of the Journal of the American Society of Nephrology and the launch editor-in-chief of the journal Disease Models and Mechanisms. Dr. Siegel is a former chief editor of the journal Cell and Molecular Cell, and a former editor of Developmental Cell. She was the founding executive director of the Public Library of Science and one of the launch editors of PLoS Biology. As one of the responders, we have Susan Witte. Susan is associate professor at the Columbia University School of Social Work, and she's the associate director of the Columbia University Social Intervention Group. Her research and teaching focuses on the development, testing, and dissemination of prevention and treatment interventions targeting the co-occurrence of HIV/AIDS risk behaviors, substance abuse, and interpersonal violence among vulnerable populations. Her work has been presented at national and international venues and published in social work and public health peer-reviewed journals. And our second responder is Gary Natriello. He's the Gottesman Professor of Educational Research and Professor of Sociology and Education at Teachers College. He's the Director of the Gottesman Libraries at Teachers College and Director of Teachers College EdLab, a design and development unit devoted to creating new educational possibilities for the information age. He's the executive editor of the Teachers College Record and has served as editor of the American Educational Research Journal and as chair of the Publications Committee of the American Educational Research Association. So three people who've been deeply immersed in journal publishing and in contributing to journals. So I'd like to ask Vivian to start us off.
Thank you for having me, and thanks everyone for coming. I'm hoping we'll have a lively discussion, and so even though I think we've organized it with me speaking for a while and having some formal responses, I encourage you to jump up and interrupt, and really, if I can walk away with a bunch of new ways of thinking about peer review and what we might do to the system, I'll be very, very happy indeed. So how did we get here? Okay, so I just want to just outline what I'm going to try to do with this talk. You'll figure out over the course of it that I worry a lot about bias, the bias that we all bring to the process of publishing and to the process of peer review. But to have that conversation in this room, I think we need to know who we are in this room. And I'll give a bit, you've heard about me, and I want to hear about you a bit. Talk a bit about why we publish at all, both the selfish and the community-based reasons for doing that. And then what's peer review about? And then maybe I want to show you a little bit of data about the peer review process as I've picked it out. And it is very particular to the experiences I've had as an author and an editor and a reviewer of basic biomedical research and to some degree clinical research. It is not humanities, it's not social work, and so I'm really looking forward to hearing how this perspective might be similar or different in other fields. And I hope that we can discuss both small changes, ways we could twiddle peer review a bit to make it a little less biased, a little more likely to give what we're hoping peer review will give us, and then think about some larger, maybe more dramatic changes and what we would need to do if we all agreed as a community of scholars that we actually need, that peer review isn't giving us what we need, that maybe even journals aren't giving us what we need. How do we create a new system that will enable us to advance in our careers as scholars? And we rely so much on peer-reviewed journals of high stature to do that for us today that would require a lot of investment from a lot of different parties. So you've heard a bit about my background. I am a basic researcher by training. I've been an editor and an author and a reviewer, researcher, and an author's editor too at Vanderbilt. And I'm currently, and I believe that's where my other slide was, running the Center for Science Communication, which does a lot around the issue of publishing, learning how to write well, learning publishing strategy, and being a good editor too. So I work with faculty who want to become editors of journals to think about best practices. Okay. So I'm just curious about who is in this room. So how many among you consider yourselves scholars of some sort doing research in your own field? So that's a third or so of you. Pre-tenure? Oh, good set. Post-tenure? I guess, Susan, you're just post-tenure. So about half and half. Sciences, humanities. Okay, so we're split up, so this will be interesting. How many of you function as reviewers at journals? A subset, not some of the pre-tenure people, not so many. Editors of journals, we have 1, 2, 3. Publishers, are there any? Hi, welcome. Yes, you've been. I've been a publisher too, actually. Librarians, of course, and who care a lot about information, getting it, sharing it effectively. Okay, so whenever I give a talk on publishing, writing papers, strategy, I think about why do we do it to begin with. And I believe there are both selfish and community-based reasons. One is to claim that discovery, interpretation, analysis. You got there before your competition. Anyone who's read The Double Helix kind of knows that kind of sense of competition that's inherent there. And if you did something that was right and you got there first, you advance your career. You advance it through promotions, you advance it through getting funding to do future research, and so on. So there are really selfish reasons associated with publishing. And then there's what I consider the real reason we publish, which is to share what we've figured out. Because, so I come from a biology base, I have a biology background. One of the last research projects I worked on involved female sterile fruit flies. And I used to say, from the perspective of a fly, if you're sterile, you might as well be dead. So from the perspective of research, if you don't communicate what you've done so that other people can think about it, build on it, use it in their own careers, you might as well have not done it at all. And that's, so it's both selfish but also community-based. And I think it's certainly true in biomedicine, but I would argue that it's true across all of scholarship, that we depend on the research that other people have done. And our impact, if you want to think about that, the impact of our own work is to some degree measured by how people use it and develop further from it. Okay, and so how do we do that these days? Well, we use peer-reviewed journals of the highest possible stature. And I say that, and it's heartbreaking to me, the stature element. I won't talk about it very much today, but if we get back to it, I think we all know the importance of journal stature in terms of promotions and grants and all the rest of it. So we want some, and I guess kind of one way of thinking about stature is if you can get your journal into this really important, if you get your paper into this really important journal, then you have somebody has decided that it's likely to be really important. And so you don't have to wait for the importance to be proven by the fact that other people have actually made use of it or talk about it or find it important. You actually have some sort of pre-filtering function provided by journals and their reputations. And we use peer review to somehow give you a sense that you really did have a right to claim that discovery as yours. So you use reviewers to somehow be able to help the journal assess whether you get to make that claim of the discovery. So journals use it, as I said, to find out whether you have a right to make that claim, and in the basic sciences we would say whether the conclusions you draw from your research, but I think that's true too in the humanities, whether you justified them through analysis or through data gathering, and whether they're new, whether it changes somehow the way people who've thought about this field for a long time think about the problem. And then to get some gauge as to, okay, if it's both believable and new, that it's important. And that's a kind of much slipperier slope there, kind of because, what's important is, what we find interesting. And what we find interesting depends very much on who we are and what we find interesting. So that's a kind of harder one to get handled. But I think everybody asks reviewers to do some sort of assessment of that. So I ask of authors, and I'm sort of curious, today, when you think about where you're going to publish, would you publish in a journal that didn't have peer review? Nobody raises their hand. So we sort of, we've committed ourselves to the view that there's something about peer review that's magical, that somehow guarantees for us the value of the thing we publish. So I'll tell you a small personal story. The first paper I ever published was published in the Journal of Cell Biology, and I'll show you some data about Journal of Cell Biology in a little bit. And it wasn't peer reviewed, and I freaked out. It was submitted by my advisor to the Journal of Cell Biology. The handling editor was his PhD advisor. He was well equipped to assess the science. 24 hours later, the paper was in press, and I thought, oh my God, something's going to be wrong, and it's been fine. But it scared me. There's something you think that they're going to catch mistakes, and we'll talk about whether reviewers catch mistakes in a minute. And so kind of the next question is, what do you expect to get from those comments of the reviewers that's going to improve your paper? So you want peer review because you want that stamp that says this is good. But is there something, is there something you want beyond that? Beyond somebody saying, yes, I believe this is a great paper. What do you want? Okay, that's a great thing you get from review. I completely agree with that. What I would ask you is the next question. Do you need reviewers in the context of a journal submission to do that? So I have everything I publish, I write mostly editorials these days. Everything I publish, I use peers. I use peers in my field, and I use peers outside my field to look at what I've written, to tell me whether my arguments are persuasive, whether they have whether their own experiences change their perspective. And I do that before I ever submit anything. Do you do that before you submit anything? Yes, right. So the question is, why do you need another? So I would ask you to just muddle it over, saying, that's peer review in its purest form, right? And what I hope I can argue is that peer review, when it's tied to journal submission, it's hard for reviewers to do that well because of all the biases that come in. Do you ever get frustrated by the review process that it doesn't give you what you expect, that it asks for things that are unreasonable, that it seems like the reviewers don't know your field as well as you do, which actually you hope they don't because you're the expert, right? Do you ever get frustrated? So I think that's probably often the case. And have you ever felt that a review you've seen is biased? Okay, lots of nods. And I think it's one of those things that I'll get to. We expect this absence of bias in the review system, but hello, we're human, And so I think bias actually exists. So reviewers, those of you who've done that, why do you agree to review a paper in the first place? Somebody tell me, why do you review? Service to the community. So you just feel it's your job and you'll do it. Does anyone do it because they want to get an advanced view of something that's relevant to their own research? Do they do it because they feel that by being a reviewer, they have an influence over what's considered important?
I think also to ensure a certain level of quality, to make sure, particularly if it's in your field and your field is very narrow, just ensure
So a reviewer can be incredibly important by helping set the standards, community standards for what's considered a compelling argument, whether it's in science or philosophy or anything else, right? So they do, I think it is important, and I think that's one of the, I mean, if you look at, in the US, the Office of Research Integrity for, mostly biomedicine, that is considered one of the main reviewer jobs, is to kind of recognize that you're setting a community standard by what you ask for. I think that's right. Do you ever worry about your own biases as reviewers? Yeah, I do. I mean, I definitely, I think, do you recuse yourself generally from work that disagrees with work you've had in the results you've had in the past? Things that affect what you're working on now? Or do you feel that even though you know that you have your own biases, you can somehow stand above them? You think you can? You like to think you can, okay. Okay, so my perspective, having seen lots of reviews in journals like Cell and PLoS Biology, and the journals I work on now, JASON and DMM, is that the methodological issue, which is a really important one, often is missing from a review that I see. When you get to some of these really high, certainly at the kind of highest profile journals, they tend to think, well, if I don't see it as a Cell paper, I don't even have to think about the methodology. And so there are a lot of journals, and the reviews become dismissive. And the reason for that being dismissive, I think is worth discussing. And these days, and it wasn't true when I started in research, there seems to be a request for additional work. Oh, I mean, I've seen in the past decade, I can count on my hands the number of times I've accepted a paper, or reviewers have recommended that a paper be accepted without revision. And I have handled something like 10,000 papers in that period. That's a tiny, 0.1% of the papers I see these days. And I should say that's different from my own experience and the experience of my peers. So I just turned 50, and I published 6 first author papers as a graduate student. I had papers accepted and I had papers rejected, but I never was asked to do another experiment, actually, in that time. So there's been a transition. I'll show you some data on that. And so when reviewers ask for additional work, editors tend to just follow that request. And I think there is an inherent fear, particularly at high stature places in basic science where the editors are not full-time academics. I think it's particularly true there. There's a real fear of publishing. Publishing is a public act. Everyone knows when you publish something that turns out to be flawed. And if the reviewers aren't, addressing the technical quality of the work, and you go off to your next meeting with people you'd been graduate students with their postdocs, and they say, how come you didn't see that flaw, that glaring flaw in the paper? It's terrifying. So a lot of editors will just insist that every reviewer gets satisfied to the nth degree, and so that can really slow the process down. And if the paper is rejected after 2 or 3 rounds of review, which happens not unusually in journals like Nature and Science and Cell, then it starts all over again. And so some people, I've seen this chart from a colleague of mine at the University of Iowa about a particular paper he published that took something like 3 years from start to finish before he went from his first submission to actually seeing the light of day. And now I worked at Public Library of Science, where I'm a big open access advocate, and one of our arguments for access is that the faster you can get the work out there for other people to see and use, the faster research goes. Now, if we as editors are creating 2-year, 3-year delays from submission to acceptance for things that may not really matter, then we are creating a much bigger problem than the 6 months to a year or whatever that now exists in the current time from publication to when a lot of journals now make their work freely available. And I think editors really need to think about what they're doing when they're just asking for additional experiments. Okay, so this led me to write an editorial a couple of years ago where I said, it's ironic, here we are in this internet era where we could blog our results if we wanted to, or put them out on Google as a little entity of knowledge. We submit them to these journals and it takes longer. My sense is it takes longer than it ever did to get published. And I realized here I am a scientist by training and I just put out this claim. So I wanted to know whether that was true, at least in the fields in which I've worked. So I looked at the Journal of Cell Biology. I said it was the first journal that I'd ever published in, and that's why I had a particular interest in looking at it. I published my paper in June of 1985, so it's a very self-oriented bit of preliminary research. I looked at 2 intermediate years, and I did this analysis in 2008. And I just looked at the published records for time from submission to acceptance, and I'm going to show you those data with a little bit of commentary as I go along. So the red line's the median, okay, June of 1985, so that little dot at the bottom, 0 days, that was my paper, so it was a little bit unusual even then. The median time from submission to acceptance in 1985 was 87 days, 87 days, I believe. 97, 12 years later, it was about the same. And then somewhere around 2000 or so, 2002, 2003, we got electronic journal submission. So we actually cut a lot of time of mailing reviews out, having 2 weeks later getting something back saying I can't do this. If everything was the same, we'd sort of expect the time from submission to acceptance to go down. And in clinical research, actually, where people have tracked it, it has to some degree gone down. Because in clinical research, you can't actually redo the clinical research, right? That's done. It's been rearranged long before you started. But in basic research, you can always do another experiment. And here we are, where things should be moving faster, and now we've doubled. We're now 180 days. And I've spoken with editors at Journal of Cell Biology, and they say this is an underestimate of the real time it takes from submission to acceptance, because if you go past the time window that's required for resubmission, quite often they'll set the clock back to 0. So we're sort of losing those. So you saw some of these outliers, 400, 500 days in the early things. We're missing a lot of those in our electronic data records because we just no longer consider them revisions anymore. But even so, our median has now gone up to 6 months at a good cell biology journal. But it's not, the thing every cell biologist strives to get into is the thing that's going to make their careers. So if it's happening there, it's pretty bad. So this is all very basic research oriented, I understand, but I do think there's some data here behind that claim I've made. And it's led a bunch of people, so I was writing the editorial, I chatted with people about the pain of publishing, and there have been a lot of editorials and news articles about this. Günter Blobel, Global Nobel Prize winner here in New York at Rockefeller, said the competition among scientists is so outrageous these days that asking for more experiments is mostly used as a tool to slow down a competitor, either to gain time to publish a competing result, or in general, to not let the competitor get too far ahead. So reviewers are abusing their ability to be anonymous, to ask for more experiments, to just keep their competitors from getting ahead. That's Günter Blobel's perspective. Martin Raff and Peter Walter and Sandy Johnson wrote an editorial that came out in Science that said it's really sad now. Career advancement can depend more on where you publish than what you publish. And so authors are so keen to publish in these top journals like Science that they will carry out lots of extra work, even when the results really strengthen the conclusions only marginally. So we've got this, and it sort of led to this view that something like this, running the gauntlet, would be easier than getting a paper published in today's journal environment. So it leads us to, and I want to have self-disclosure. Here's a bit of advice I give when I teach publishing strategy. If reviewers are always going to ask for more, you can anticipate that. You can guide what they request by how you write your paper, so that the paper is complete on the surface, but leads future directions, something you actually want to give them at the end of the day. Now that is really cynical, disheartening advice that says, game the system. You know the game, you know what they're going to do. Until we can change reviewer behavior, anticipate this. And I've talked to a lot of people that publish in my field, the top journals in basic biology, and they all do that. And that's sad. That's really sad. Okay. So why is that? I think it's worth kind of asking that question, and I think all the players involved in publishing have something to do with that. I'm glad to hear you use reviewers before you submit a paper. I think there are a lot of people in the world that are afraid to do that, that somehow it feels less scary to send a paper in not very good shape to a journal where everything's anonymous and the criticisms are anonymous than to use someone down the hall, because it's scary to you to get someone to be critical. It's scary to them to be critical. But I think that kind of peer review has decreased dramatically, and I think that's a problem. For some reason, reviewing has changed. It may be competition. I don't think there's been any research to gather data on this, but there are people who have the view that as funding drops, people in the world become more competitive in basic biomedical research, and so they start asking for more and more. It may be that those are the reviews they're seeing. I mean, one of the things I find really interesting about, at least, kind of academic scholarship within basic science is it's very much an apprenticeship where you learn how to do what you're doing by assuming that your mentors know how to do what they're doing. And so you write your papers the way your mentors write their papers, you write reviews based on how you see reviews, and you're not really trained in any formal way in terms of, kind of what does a good paper look like, what does a good review look like, what's an editor, and I think the same is true of editors, actually. So there's that problem with the apprenticeship, and so I think part of it is that we just think that's what we're expected to do. And I think there's a part about the editorial job, and I'll talk about that in more detail. I think we ask reviewers often as editors to tell us what we should publish, and I don't think reviewers can tell editors that. To do that, they really need to somehow understand everything about that journal and what it's publishing, to understand other decisions that are being made by the journal and be consistent, and to not have their own inherent biases to come out. So at one time in my career, I was running 3 different journals as an editor, Cell, Molecular Cell, and Developmental Cell, and I could tell, even though I didn't want it to happen, that what was flowing through one journal over the other would influence what editors were feeling about particular papers. If they said, well, we've got tons of these kinds of papers in this journal, but we don't have enough in that journal, and then it's not really fair to the paper to do that. And you have to know your biases to fight your biases, I think. And and there I was, a professional editor, it was all I was doing, and I could feel my biases popping up. So I think, kind of asking that of reviewers is really asking too much. Okay, so let's think about how we might change things if we believe it's a problem. And I had a lot of advice the first time I gave this talk, and I've erased most of it, but here I'll just drum it up. I think you do need to use your peers before you submit. And reviewers and editors, I think we need to do our jobs and not each other's jobs. We need to recognize that biases exist, to disclose biases, and to err on the side of recusal to avoid those biases, if we can. And when I think about a paper, I want to kind of talk a little bit about, kind of what's the perfect paper from the perspective of publishing. Within basic research, when I teach manuscript writing, I tend to think about papers, research papers, being 2 separate papers that are tied together and one translates to the other. There's the paper you write for other people who are doing research in your own field. And when I read papers in fields in which I've been trained, I tend to focus on these things, the methods, can they possibly get data that are meaningful based on what they're doing, the data themselves, and the legends to that. So do I actually agree to some degree, what are the conclusions based on looking at the data? Forget for a moment what they say their conclusions are. And I would generally not read any other part of a paper when it's in my own field. As an editor or somebody out thinking about a field that's not my own, I actually read completely differently. I tend to ignore the data because I can't really understand it. And as an editor, I shouldn't be assessing it. And I rely on the paper itself to teach me about what's going on. And so they're written with different languages, and they're written with different expectations and different audiences. And so when I teach manuscript writing, that's what I said, those 2 pieces, they definitely need to tie together, and they need to translate well. So they have to be actually telling the same story, but they actually need to do it. And this outsider community changes depending on the journal. So at least in basic biomedical research, the higher the stature, the bigger that outsider group. And so the paper needs to be written differently depending on what your intended audience is. In a paper in your own very specific field, the editor and the reviewer have a very similar knowledge set. So one might argue in very small fields that editors can function as experts on the papers that they get. Okay, so the perfect paper to me is one that can satisfy the experts, right, the reviewers and experts who are going to read it, that the data do lead to those conclusions, and the conclusions will advance their own work or thinking, and it satisfies non-experts to understand and appreciate the new knowledge, why it's important. and that translation is accurate. One of the reasons I stopped reading results sections of papers in my own field is they used to anger me. They'd say a conclusion, I'd look at the data, and I'd go, that's not right. And somehow that translation, whether it's simplification or wishful thinking or something, I don't think people check the translation very often in the process. Okay, so editors expect from reviewers, so I would say for those things, I think the reviewer job from the perspective of the editor is, does it satisfy you from the data, and can you tell me whether it's been translated appropriately? And the editor can then say, if it's translated appropriately, is this something I understand, why it's important, why it belongs in the journal? So editors expect reviewers to spot methodological flaws in their area of expertise. Now, in basic biomedicine, papers are getting really complicated and collaborative, and I don't think any individual author could be an expert in the entire paper, nor is any individual reviewer an expert in the entire paper. And so they expect reviewers to identify flaws in their areas, and by the way, to kind of disclose that they can't assess areas that are outside their expertise, and not to try to assess areas outside their expertise. Editors expect reviewers to raise flags of some sort, whether they think there's something that's been handled inappropriately, whether something looks like the data's been manipulated, the data are too good to be true, there might be some fraud going on, they expect that flag raising. They want to know about flaws in translation because they can't identify them themselves. And they want some unbiased assessment of importance, which, as you could probably tell, I think is really hard to get. Okay, so let's just talk about that first one. So we rely on reviewers to set standards for the field and to assess, find major methodological flaws. Okay, so this is a paper that was published by Richard Smith and co. So Richard Smith was the editor of the British Medical Journal for a long time, on the effects of training on the quality of peer review. And so I would say BMJ is one of the few, it's not the only journal, but it's one of the few journals that have started to look at reviewer quality, create measurements that, that they can validate, sort of assessment of reviewer quality, and then think about training of reviewer quality. So what they did here is they took a very kind of standard clinical trial paper, and clinical trials are formulaic. You have to have a justification for doing the clinical trial in the first place. You have to work with biostatisticians to figure out what your N is, how many patients you need to do. You want to randomize it, control it. You have to figure out your numbers and do the right statistical analysis. So it's pretty straightforward going from paper to paper. So clinical trials reviewers should all be able to review clinical trials and spot methodological flaws. So they inserted 14 flaws specifically into these papers, and they asked reviewers to identify these flaws. And so here they had 9 major errors. Did it have justification, randomization, sample size, the reporting of the sample size, kind of big problems that should block this paper from ever going in. And they inserted 9 of those and 5 more minor errors, like no ethics committee approval, stuff like that, And they asked how many, so they did an assessment before training and after training, what's our baseline? How many flaws do these reviewers pick up? And after I train them to the sorts of things we want them to look for, that all clinical trials should have, how much does that change if I actually give them the training, and how long does that training last? And so any guesses as to how many errors are picked up by the reviewers? And Rebecca, we already talked about this, so you cannot. 9 major errors. How many do you think? 4? 3. Yeah, it was 2.6 was the average, plus or minus 1 or so. There were 9 of them. So it's like they can't pick these. Okay, then they did training. I actually don't know if I have the data. Okay. Then they did training, and they managed after training to get 1 more. So if we can't, and these are very standard kinds of trials. Now and we could have a long discussion about why it is that reviewers who agreed to be in the study, so you would imagine there's this bias, the Hawthorne effect, right? You sort of know you're in a study, you're going to do your best job. You don't find these flaws. Is it that you have an expectation of the journal not sending papers with flaws like this because editors, everyone should be able to catch them? I don't know why, and we can have that discussion. But the fact is these reviewers, for things that really should be catching, aren't catching them even after training. So they do a little bit better, and 6 months later that's all gone, by the way. They're back to their 2.6. Okay, so the study has confirmed the limitations of peer review as witnessed by reviewers' failure to detect major methodological errors in 3 straightforward accounts of randomized controlled trials. So training led to some improvement in the detection of errors and recommendation, but with the exception of the recommendation, these improvements were really slight and didn't last. So I'm sort of wondering, I'm sort of left there going, if we expect from kind of first and foremost reviewers to be catching methodological problems, and they're failing to do that, it really makes me worry. Okay, this is only clinical trials, and it may not be true in your field, but it's something that needs to be thought about, and I would really love to see, and we're starting to think about ways to do this kind of peer review research. This was a lovely one because it was really a randomized controlled interventional trial, which is rare, but to do something like that in other areas and figure out whether reviewers can do that. Yes? Yes, 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 yes. That's right. I think you're completely right. And I actually also, there's another issue too. You talked about often the reviewers are PIs, and in basic science, many PIs are not currently actively engaged in research, right? So they're not going to know, okay, I was a biochemist by training. I know certain proteins are really sticky, right? So you try a certain column, everything, it sticks to this column. It'll stick to any column. I know that. I knew that for certain proteins in my area. But my PI didn't know that, right? So kind of looking for those sorts of, what is the problem? You actually would do better for that assessment with people who are really actively engaged in research. So, you can imagine a review working in which you say, okay, I'm going to do this. I have more of a perspective on the field as a whole, but I don't actually do the methods anymore. And what I really want are people who are actively engaged in the methods to evaluate the methods as part of that process. So that's one way you might imagine. And then they don't have, then they can think of it, then the ego isn't such an issue because they can say, I've used this as a training tool for my students because they're learning how to give a review, and they're making sure that the methods are, they're the ones who are up to date in the methods, and they can help. So that's one possibility.
In your overall evaluation of peer review, do you make any distinction or do you uncover any major differences between basic research and clinical research? You mentioned a few.
Right. So I haven't. A lot of the research on peer review that I've read is clinical. A lot of the editors have gotten involved. Pardon me. Well, it's like everything else, it has its history. So there was a deputy editor of which journal is it? Drum and Rennie, Lancet, BMJ. He's one of the medical journal editors. He actually started a peer review congress. He's a medical journal editor. He said, we're going to start looking at peer review carefully. And because it was started in medicine, in a medical journal, a lot of the work has happened in medical journals. I think another reason why a lot of that happens in medicine is that medical journal editors, whether they're doing it with even if they're doing it with 95% of their time, as like the journal editor of the New England Journal or the Lancet or BMJ, all of those journal editors maintain their licenses to practice. So they too recognize their community commitment, and I think that's part of what the self-reflection reflects from my perspective. Basic research editors at the highest profile journals kind of leave their careers, and it's one of the reasons I'm back in academia, actually, is because I actually think that's dangerous to the editorial discipline, if there is one. I do think my own experience with basic research has been that reviewers have, by and large, at the highest profile journals, have not focused on major flaws. What they have picked up for me as an editor have been things that I thought of as new, that they sort of said, justifiably or unjustifiably was not so new, kind of pointing out the data that existed that I couldn't find back in the pre-PubMed days, But these days with searches, they do that less and less, I would say. I think reviewers in basic sciences will throw out things that slow down review without justification quite a lot. They'll do things like, this is a purely descriptive study. There's no mechanism here, and mechanism is such a soft term. I worked for a journal that wanted basic biological mechanism, or mechanism underlying basic biological processes cell. But mechanism, you can always ask for more mechanism from the basic science side until you get to atomic resolution, at which point some people are bored, right? So all that means is you've interested me, so I stopped with mechanism, already. So there's kind of, so if they say no mechanism, that stops it. We already knew this. I mean, every now and then you hear that at a high-profile journal, editor will say, well, it's not new, I don't want it, without any evidence. So one of the things the Office of Research Integrity says is, if you say something like that, give the evidence underlying that claim. Show me the 1 paper or the 10 papers. And, I won't give numbers, but I've certainly had the experience that people have made that claim. And then when I've gone to do the literature search, I haven't found this prior knowledge that's been claimed by the reviewers. And so those sorts of things happen a lot in basic science. And I think that, on the clinical side, so the journal I work on, that's nephrology, does both basic research and clinical, so I do see some comparisons. There, the issue is clinical impact, right? So how do I know this approach will be better than the approach that already exists? And there are different perspectives. I think people have different inherent views about whether they can guess that impact, right? There's a kind of hubris element, that happens in all reviewing. I don't see why this is going to change my practice. It's great if you can promote it. You can immediately see it. That's a good thing. It's hard in other ways. Mark Kirshner, a mentor of mine, once challenged me to think in retrospect at papers that had mixed reviews. So somebody who got really excited about the paper and somebody who was really bored by it. And sort of the editor tendency, given that people are afraid to publish, is to go with the most jaded reviewer, the person who says it's boring, tends to be right. His view, as you could hear, was that that's probably the opposite. That if out of 2 or 3 people you can get somebody really jazzed, it's probably more likely to be important than, But then if you can, talk about randomness, you had, 3 people, if one of those you happen to get excited, it's kind of insane. That's probably more than you.
Speaking of that, there are major articles that were rejected in the that were breakthroughs.
Absolutely.
There's more than a handful of them.
Absolutely.
Those reflect bias on the part.
Yeah, I think absolutely. What I used to say when we started.
Or adherence to the prevailing dogma.
Yeah, right. So there are biases, kind of systematic biases that everyone has. Positive in clinical trials, positive results over negative results. Things that are dangerous. Likely to be toxic, those newsworthy things. There are biases in the other direction against things that break dogma. It's harder the standard for proof becomes much higher. Right, and that's the kind of bias point, right? So that's exactly where we're headed, was kind of the issue of bias. So I just mentioned the unconscious biases of kind of positive results being more exciting, therefore more likely to be published, and that becomes really problematic within all research, clinical trials in particular, where you only get the positive effects and you don't see the negative ones, so that's a problem. But it's true in basic research too, and all kinds of research, and then there's the challenge dogma, which you just mentioned. So there are also reviewer inherent biases, so work that comes to conclusions that are different than this body of work you've built up over your entire lifetime. Tell me you're not going to, the first paper I was asked to handle when I was a graduate student basically said the work of my PhD advisor, and I was his first student, was an artifact. And he handed me the paper, and he said, identify the flaw in this paper. It had to be flawed. It disagrees with me, QED, it's flawed, And I found flaws, but it was definitely, that was my task, and that's, so that's a problem. Work that causes their own work to be less novel. So you're working on something, you're getting ready to publish it, and now if this thing comes out, it's not going to matter as much, and you're not going to get the stature and profile. And their own experience in a particular journal. I think this is really, there was a time when I started at Cell, I can tell this story, there was a field, intermediate filaments was the field, and I tell you, the reviewers in that field, they had the view that if they'd had a paper rejected by Cell the last decade, there was nothing in intermediate filaments that was going to get into Cell, because there was nothing that could be more important than that paper that had been rejected 10 years ago. QED, it's not publishable. And that hurts the field, it hurts the process of reviewing, and that one at least was explicit. It was kind of easy to see those biases. But if we go around saying, I'm going to send this off to experts, and I'm going to expect them to give me unbiased reviews, you're really in trouble. You sort of need to know their biases. I had a paper that was handled by a clinical epidemiologist at the Nephrology Journal, said as she looked at her reviews, this work agrees with the work of reviewer 1, who loves the paper. It disagrees with the reviewer 2, who hates the paper. You're sort of like, okay, that was useful, you know, and you sort of need to know that. But I remember at Cell kind of systematically doing that. I want to send this to people who disagree with this work, sort of, because if they can be persuaded, that's pretty powerful. But the fact that they can't be is almost meaningless, and you know, because of biases that exist. And so I think, yes.
Sorry, it just sounds like the biases between reviewers are inevitable. So I think, shouldn't there be a higher expectation for editors? Because they have to find a say. Because they have to be the neutral.
Yes, I do. And I think one of the things that editors need to do is sort of recognize, if they're going to use peer review, that their reviewers are biased, that they're specialized in particular areas, and to read the reviews remembering why they sent that paper to that reviewer to begin with, right? And so really play the role of interpreter and not just say, well, there are negative comments here. And I think one of the things reviewers tend to do is feel they have to comment on everything, and they will act as experts for things they really don't know that much about. And there too, editors need to say, okay, I'm going to discount this negative comment because without understanding how this person, that wasn't why I sent this paper. So you really have to somehow have a rubric to assess the reviews. And I think editors, by and large, don't do that anymore in many, many fields. We used to, you know, when I started as an editor, we felt we couldn't review a paper until we'd taken really good notes on it. Think, what do I need to learn from the editors in order to decide whether to publish the paper and under what conditions? And then when I get the reviews back, I fit that into that perspective. Quite often what happens now when people, as editors, feel overstretched is they'll say, oh, it's an interesting topic, I'll review it, and see what they say. And then they try to work out what they think. And that's actually really hard to do. It's like trying to think with people talking with two different voices in each ear, and you know, it's really, really hard. So I think you do need to know the reviewers and know their biases and their publication history, and recognize you're also biased, right? So in the fields in which I've worked, I sort of know what a big deal question is. My job as an editor is to know what big deal questions are in other fields. It's really easy to yawn. You know, I had a deputy editor at Cell who, you know, if it was molecular biology, she just, you know, she made it very physically obvious she wasn't interested. And that affects the whole room, you know, kind of what those things do in terms of editorial decisions, you know. And you hate to have to communicate that to an author. Well, somebody yawned during an editorial meeting, and so I can't publish your paper. You know, it's not justifiable. But you are biased. And there are things that capture your interest and things that don't, and you're biased by bad writing when it's about the data, right? You're biased by lots of things, by what that person's history was, you know. Are you trying, you know, here's a reviewer who wrote something dismissive. That reviewer publishes really great stuff in your journal. Are you going to go against that opinion even though you think it's biased? If you think that it might mean you don't get the next paper from this really important person, you know, there are lots of there are lots of things that come in there that you might not want to act on, but can sit there subconsciously affecting your opinion. Okay, so we just talked about that. Reviewers can do certain things, but they shouldn't be the ones to make the decisions. That's the editor's job, and I won't go into all of that. I've published it. And I think editors really do need to consciously and explicitly relieve reviewers of that expectation. So when I write letters to reviewers now, I say, I'm not asking you to tell me whether to publish this paper. I want to remind you that, you know, you can help me make that decision, but I don't expect you to know what we're going to publish or know what else we're doing. Be wary of all kinds of bias, and to maintain a group of people you trust that are really committed to the journal, whether it's your own internal editorial team or a handful of people who function as academic editors for the journal. They can't be on every editorial board. They have to be committed to you in a handful of places so they can really think about what is this journal trying to achieve and how does this paper match what we're up to and what we're trying to do. You need to give clear advice. You need to provide clear and constructive decisions to authors, and you need to recognize that actually your duty is to publish, and that you don't want to hold, I mean, I found it took me a decade, I have to admit, where I didn't just ask for an experiment because I knew it would make the paper better. It would be better for Cell if we had a better paper, but it's not necessarily would shift it from publishable, not publishable, but publishable, which is the threshold that I should be thinking about. It would be, and that's And I think that's something a lot of editors don't think about because it's scary to publish. And ethically, you need to listen to appeals. You know, it is true that editors, although they can be very clear about what their journal's about, are almost by definition not going to be expert in the papers that they're assessing and making decisions on. And they may be following a line of logic, and you'd be willing to, you know, kind of be clear about what the logic is that led you to that decision. It may rely too heavily on something that the field knows isn't reproducible, or and therefore shouldn't be held in quite the same way. So I think that's ethics. And so, yeah, we were talking about Sarah Palin last night that came out. Bias comes in all forms, and everybody involved in publishing is biased. All humans are biased. And I think most suggestions that I think about when I think about improving peer review in the current system are really aimed at trying to reduce bias. So if you think about the bias of a reputation of an author, own history or institution, that's what double-blind peer review is about, right? It's kind of getting away from the zip code effect, as we like to say. If you think about competitions between authors and reviewers, that's what open peer review is about in some way. You can't just, you can't hide behind anonymity to keep a competitor's work from print if you have to sign that work. And then there's this other piece, which I think, from my own experience, is journal specific, is reviewer history at a particular journal, which I already talked about. And so it's hard, I think, not to assess a paper that you read to a paper you've tried to publish in that same journal. And so one thing I've been toying with is whether you can actually create a system that does what I call journal blind peer review. A group of journals that are in the same field, all quality journals, slightly different standards of significance or what they're after or whatever, you don't know which journal it's at. And maybe that will help you stay away from your own experience at the journal. And the reason I think about this and why I expect that it would help is my experience launching new journals. And so, of course, this is just anecdote, but I remember in the early days of every journal I've ever launched, when I've sent papers for review, reviewers would come back and say, I don't know what to advise you because I don't know what you're publishing. I guess I'll just have to stick to the strengths and weaknesses of this paper and let you decide. And I'd say, thank you, that's all I want, And at the same time, authors would come to me, whether the paper was accepted or rejected, and say those were the most constructive reviews I'd ever seen. And so I have this suspicion, but as a scientist by training, I want some data, that if we could keep this out of the view of the reviewer, they'd do a better job. And then there's the question of whether we need peer review at all, and I do want to finish up because I know we want to have time for responses and discussion, is I do think peer review is valuable for constructive feedback. When it becomes part of the gatekeeper function, deciding what to publish, it pushes bias, I think. It pushes competition. And so there are people who are playing with peer review in this way. So they're saying authors get to select their reviewers. There are some journals that do that. They're saying, I'll be happy if these people review my paper. They could have done that before submission, but kind of you can do it in the context of submission. I completely believe we need our peers to give us feedback. I'm just not so sure that doing it in the context of the journal solves more problems than it creates, my own view. Do we need journals? Here I've spent my career making journals, editing journals. Journals function as a kind of pre-filter source. So what is it that I actually ought to be reading, and can I aggregate them in some way so that's useful to my supposed readership? These days people find things a lot through searching. Most people I know have a handful of journals they like to read, sometimes for the news that's in them, sometimes because it's really the journal for their specific community and they just want to, it keeps them up to date on those other things. But a lot of people are going after what they want through their own searches. And I am struck by the fact that Richard Smith, who's probably done more research on peer review than anyone, the former editor of the BMJ, no longer believes in peer review at all. He wants the crowd to assess things after publication. There are ways to assess things after publication now. I mean, we've got it in all sorts of arenas. We could have it in the sciences and in academic research as well. And there are aggregators all over the place for research, for news, and all that sort of stuff. So we could, one could imagine a day where we lived without these pre-filters. Now, to do that, we need a completely different tenure and promotion and grant system. we need to accept that we don't know how important something's going to be until it gets used, and that we can't make instant judgments on what somebody's published in terms of their tenure. And I think that's, that's a big question. But I do think this discussion is really worth having, because if we, there's so much grumbling that's going on about peer review, and yet we just kind of accept it as the matter of course. And I think the experiments being done are interesting, but they are kind of minor. Many of them are really minor experiments. And if it's really not giving us what we need, then it's up to us to figure out how to do that. And so just kind of reminding you of what I think of as the perfect paper. I think you can get that paper without peer review as part of journal submission. And I think this conversation will somehow make it possible for us to have peer review do what it needs to do, be part of that conversation of research, and not simply a judge over it. So thank you for your attention here, and I'm going to leave it back.
Great, thank you. That was fabulous. So I've been asked to come and speak for a few minutes as a respondent to Dr. Siegel's presentation as actually as a newly tenured faculty member, so someone who has perhaps a particular take on the peer review system, and as a social worker, actually, frankly. And social science looks a little bit different than biological or medical sciences in terms of the review process and its relative success. So clearly the system worked for me, and my anxiety went up 2 or 3 years ago when I realized that I had to start making decisions about whether to go open access for quicker publishing or draw that timeline of how I was going to get 3 more papers into the review system and published before my ad hoc committee came up, so that my CV was beefed up. So certainly the system worked for me, but I think that the issue of timing and the length of time continues to be something that we're all going to struggle with, unless we're going to consider some new models that might speed up the process. I do think that in applied professions like social work that maybe, or social services, public health, what feels different for me is that the immediacy is not there in peer review. And so even though the time takes, on average, at least 6 months in something like the American Journal of Public Health to 18 months to 2 years from submission to publication for some of our other journals, that the experiments, the random clinical trials, the randomized clinical trials that we tend to do take 4 or 5 years to implement anyway. So we don't have that kind of experience where you simply sort of, unless you're doing epidemiology and secondary data analysis, you can't actually do another experiment upon resubmission, and you have to work with the data that you have, and you have to wait for the data to come, and things don't, there's not that sort of same competition, I don't think, because things aren't moving as fast. But that said, I think we are concerned about, I certainly have always been concerned as a up-and-coming person recognized in my field with the kind of contribution that I make. And I think that the content of a particular paper is often and has often been influenced by what we were talking about in terms of the editor's take of what the journal how the journal wants to represent itself, but then also who the reviewers are. And what works in terms of the peer review system, I think, for someone who's a junior faculty member is to be invited to be a reviewer at the same time that you're submitting papers to be reviewed, because I think that particularly from sort of a social work, social justice perspective, gives you some balance, right? You're making decisions and you are seeing what's being submitted, and that gives you a little bit more self-efficacy in terms of what your piece of work is looking like. But I couldn't agree more. I made notes. I think that if we encouraged our doctoral students and our junior faculty to do a much better job of peer review, true peer review, prior to submission, that we'd see better quality work being moved more quickly. So I actually wonder if I've heard peers say that they're going to submit something because they're going to get feedback from the reviewers anyway, and it's not quite ready, but we'll get that in first submission. So I know that people have been using the process in the way it's not directed to be used, and that can become problematic. So it works for being a reviewer, and it works for for us to be able to build our CV. One of the, I actually thought after reading some of the work that's been published, including your editorial or your op-ed piece, was that I think of that Churchill quote about democracy, like it's the best form of government except all others. And so when faced with the question, how would you change peer review and make it better? I mean, I kind of like it. It works, kind of, and then you start to make the list of all the flaws, particularly the bias, and then you breathe a heavy sigh, and I think particularly coming from a place of our academic discipline, which tries to look at the ways that we really privilege some groups and some types of access to knowledge versus those that are sort of marginalized, that really it's stopped to make me think, what are the better ways that we could improve peer review to make it more democratized, like open access? And of course there are challenges with that as well. I think around the issue of flaws, again, if it shapes and controls the way that new research is screened for quality, that can be a problem. And how it gets communicated and to whom, and that the peer review process creates that border for us between the experts and then the general public. And in social work and social sciences, I think that perhaps that's a different concern than in some medical sciences, in the sense that my community of scholars, you know, we're talking about randomized clinical trials around HIV prevention interventions or intimate partner violence prevention or treatment programs. And really those that are making access to the academic journals and the empirical knowledge are not the same people who are practicing that in the field. So this is not just a problem of peer review. This is actually why NIH is entirely restructuring their peer review system and their relative value as they look at what it is that they're going to fund moving forward from 2010, is that we're really not doing perhaps enough innovative and impactful work. We're keeping the academic machine going, and we are building knowledge. And again, this is different because I think in medicine it's harder to sort of see that spinning wheels, doing lots of efficacy trials, and you know, we can say for the 100th time we found one more program to help reduce, to help increase condom use and reduce risk. Well, it's really time to move that to effectiveness and dissemination research, and our journals have been developed in the last 2 or 3 decades around best evidence. But what happens is then all the reviewers that are part of the system of support for best knowledge are kind of stuck in that place of the randomized trial as the gold standard, and these are the methods that we should be looking for in our review. So there's not as much room for innovation, a changing way of looking at how we might solve some of the problems. So that actually speaks to, I think, the system of peer review in the sense that it sort of it separates out the expert from maybe the lay or the practitioners who are clinical practitioners in the field, and as well it speaks to how we can introduce ways to shift the thinking from time to time. Maybe that has to do with a competition, maybe that has to do with NIH. I think since a lot of what we write comes from funding, it has to start with the funding. So maybe as that process shifts, then indeed the peer review system will shift somewhat. And I guess the other thing that I'm very concerned about in terms of the peer review system, again, is how we shift it, and I don't think it's specific to peer review, but how we shift it to reach more of the practitioners, how we actually take what it is that we're publishing in our peer-reviewed journals, and are we including in the peers who are part of the review boards, practitioners who are in the field who actually could speak more to how we translate from science from bench to trench, right? From the science to the practical application. And I hope that as we take a look at changing peer review moving forward, that we might be able to consider ways to strengthen the application of the science in professional fields. So as I was preparing my talk, and I was stuck on the issue of timing and how long it took, and I was thinking about this one particular case where it took me 2 years to get something published. Up on my computer screen, I heard the Windows beep, and I got a new email. And the subject line, it was from WebMed Central, and the subject line was, "Successfully publishing your research within 48 hours." And I thought, wow, you know, that's like under the category of you can't make that stuff up. I was sitting there and I thought, I have to find out what this is. And so sure enough, it was one of these. I looked more closely, and it was, they claim that if it's a reasonably well done study, they can publish it in 48 hours, but they also do post-publication review. I love this idea. I think that's actually a way to both keep a peer review process, and we'll talk about this in discussion, I'm sure, but that might be a really nice compromise between keeping intact what we know can vet best quality science, but also open up an opportunity for the community to give reflections on what can work and what doesn't work about it. So I love that. And then there was the August 23rd article in the Times that talked about how they did an experiment, the Shakespeare Quarterly trial, where they took a corps of experts and they posted online a series of essays. And so this would be actually humanities. I would be really interested to hear from humanities people in the audience about what you think. But then they, over I think a week's time, 41 people made 350 comments, and they used that commentary and peer review to give feedback to the authors to improve the publication. So, I mean, there's obviously got to be a line between how much information goes into making a final decision and who those peers are, and there's all kinds of quality assurance to be built in there that could be quite challenging. But I love that idea. And so then the last thing I want to share is that on this issue of sort of social justice and bias and whose biases are determining what gets published and how, I shared this brief anecdote with a few of you earlier that my most difficult rejection, and thankfully I've only had a few, but the most difficult rejection was when I had submitted a piece with a colleague. We had done a randomized clinical trial where we recruited 217 couples, predominantly African American and Latino, in the South Bronx, and we ran an HIV prevention intervention where we were testing whether we could increase condom use and reduce unprotected sex among couples after testing a 6-session intervention. And so one of the challenges that remains in randomized clinical trials, historically in the U.S., continues to be the ability to recruit minority participants. You know, since Tuskegee, since the establishment of the Office of Health, Human Subjects Protections, we still have that as a major issue that influences the quality of the data and the ability to actually do research that's, I think, you know, going to reach the broadest audiences. So what we decided to do, we thought would be innovative, would be to do a piece where we looked at the process of recruitment and sort of described that. How were we successful in recruiting 217 couples? How did we break down those barriers? So it was a very process-oriented paper. And we combined that with a quantitative paper that looked at who was eligible and what their characteristics were, and then who enrolled and what their characteristics were. And there was some very interesting statistics that sort of defined who we missed, and then we talked about it. So we put it together as 2 papers. And the editor of a very well-known, at the time, there weren't as many AIDS education and prevention journals, but the editor looked at both pieces and read our cover letter that said, we really think that this is important because we really believe that a lot of scientists are interested in hearing more about, you know, how you can, first of all, successfully recruit and retain, then look at this data. And so he looked at it and he said, well, there's really not enough meat in this recruitment piece, but I really like the, you know, data-based piece, so I'm going to keep that one and log it in. You really should try submitting the other one to a women's health journal or to a minority health journal. And I kept the letter because I was so incensed. I mean, I haven't met him yet at a conference, but the day that I do, I'm going to tell him, you know, there was so much nuanced in that communication that made me crazy. So, and I know that's not exactly a peer review related question, but it kind of is in the sense that he had a very strong bias, one about quantitative versus qualitative, and in terms of what he wanted to see in his journal, but we really believed, you know, being on the ground, that this was an important piece that would be complementary. And so we wound up publishing them separately, and they both got published. But it really made me start to think more about these issues that we're going to struggle with, I think, around bias and who controls some of these decisions about what gets published. So, thanks.
So I think I just agreed with just about everything Vivian said, so I'll try to add a little bit to the discussion around general agreement. A couple things that I think are worth just stating at the outset, and it's a little counterintuitive. Publishing and editing and submitting and so forth, at least from afar, seems like a non-emotional activity. And the one thing that I've learned with lots of years of editing and lots of years of submitting and many rejections and some acceptances is it's deeply emotional for just about everybody involved. And that's true of the editor, it's true of the person submitting, it's true of the reviewer who invests their own personal time and energy in the process and expects to be respected, which is sometimes difficult for the editor to do if things work out in a particular way. The other thing I'd sort of just want to say a little bit about is one of the interesting themes that ran through, I think, the presentation was this whole issue of bias. And I think you're absolutely right. It is everywhere in the process, and what makes it problematic is we assume that it's not. So we imagine a process that is bias-free, and yet we're encountering it at every step, and we're encountering it at all of the junctures. So not just in the obvious places, but in difficult places. So for example, it's very clear to me from lots of editing that an editor can predetermine the outcome of any submission just by the reviewers that they select. And sometimes, you know, I think editors are not as aware of that fact because, of course, once you get the reviews back that you expect, you're reinforced in your initial notions of the paper, and you believe that, in fact, we've got this objective and lovely process. But just selecting the reviewers, I think, is an example of a kind of interstices where lots goes on that is often unseen and unrecognized. So one of the things I've started doing in trying to talk to people about this is really not using the word bias, because right there it sort of loads the discussion. And so I've shifted to talking about perspective, which everyone feels comfortable having, and everyone can acknowledge that others have ones that are different from their own. And sometimes people are a little more forthcoming if they talk about their perspective that tends to be more appreciative of qualitative work or quantitative work or applied work or basic work. And you can at least get people to feel somewhat more comfortable. The other thing that's useful for thinking about perspective is journals themselves have perspectives. And in fact, we sometimes call them reputations, but the perspectives that they bring are oftentimes what they believe to be valuable. Because if we are to keep journals, that is, if we are not to give up on journals, one of the reasons we might want to keep them is that even before you invest the time to read an article, as a reader of a journal that you believe you know something before you make that effort about what you're about to experience. And that's a perspective that comes to the journal. Let me say just a little bit about the different actors try to organize it a little bit. Because there was advice, I think, for all of us in this process. So for authors, I think the advice for authors to share their work early, share it before they submit it is, I think, really good advice. I think the complication in that advice is that authors find themselves in very different kinds of contexts. And some authors find themselves in very rich contexts with very experienced colleagues who are very gracious and generous with their time. Others find themselves in totally the opposite, either with very expert and ungracious and ungenerous colleagues, or isolated in institutions where they're the expert on the campus. And so there's some real issues in terms of getting back to the issue of the idea of which publications are elite and which scholars get to be elite and who gets to have status within the field, that those things are not all well distributed. So at some point we have to have enough of a forgiveness in the system that we take in papers from authors who are in situations where they can't get that kind of feedback. That turns out to be a time-consuming and difficult thing for journals to do over a period of time, but it's something we have to work on. And it's a good argument for having a broader set of journals, each of which might be taking a smaller flow of papers and therefore being able to devote more editorial time. That's not the way things tend to go, but that might be an argument for that. Implications for reviewers, I think it's intriguing, this notion that we would train reviewers. I think, as someone in the audience already mentioned, I think that's a hard thing to sell people on. One of the things that we've done with a fair degree of success is not train reviewers, but we now rate and select reviewers in a much more systematic way than we did a decade ago. So we use a very large pool of reviewers, which I've discovered from other editors tends to be not an uncontroversial decision. That is, some editors think you should have a very close-knit set of reviewers that you have known since graduate school and you can trust because you know how they've been trained. Other editors take a different perspective. We've gone to a much broader set of reviewers just because we're looking for quality reviews, which means people who will take the time, who will deal with the methodological issues, and then we track those reviews for their quality. So we know in our database if you've delivered good reviews for us in the past, unfortunately your reward is we ask you again. So no good deed goes unpunished in our system, but it actually, I think, has some promise. Editors, I think, the whole issue of editors is an intriguing one, and I've now been an editor, I guess, for almost, well, not quite 20 years, but a lot of editing time. And I was trying to think back in preparing for this, you know, what it was like to be a young editor, a beginning editor, and what it's like now to be an old editor. And I think one of the things I've come to appreciate is just how little we do to prepare people to become editors, how little support we offer them, and really how tricky that role is. It's amazingly complicated. It's very easy to get in trouble. Particularly in a lot of journals, there are solo editors and not really strong editorial support systems. So developing those kinds of systems, I think, would be helpful. I've been on a board where we've recruited and appointed and removed editors. One of the things that's clear is the sort of inclination and natural talent for editing is not widely distributed among the academic profession, nor is there any reason to believe that it should be. And so we probably underinvest, I think, in how we bring people into the editorial process and what that's like. And that goes from everything from the inability to put your own work in perspective and aside and to graciously work on someone else's work on their terms and in their perspective, but it goes beyond that. Another actor that I sort of got mentioned indirectly, I would say are review processes, tenure and promotion, career development processes. And here I think there are lots of issues that bear on this whole process. You know, it appears, and I'm about to go back on to the Tenure and Promotion Committee, so I say appears, but it appears to me that those committees are increasingly relying upon the place of publication in making the judgments that they're making. And they're less reliant upon actually, dare I say, reading the papers and making their own independent judgment of that. And so I think, you know, what I take away from that is when we sort of ask the question, should we have journals? Another way to ask the question is, should journals become less important? And in particular, can we imagine them being less important in the tenure and promotion process? And that would require different ways of conducting those kinds of reviews and a fair amount of work in preparing people to engage in that process, which itself is complicated. So I think I'll leave it there. I hope I've raised a few questions to add to the conversation, and just look forward to what folks have to say.
Well, thank you, all three. I'm going to ask you all to come up to the table here where we've got 3 mics, and remind everyone that we are taping this, and we do put these sessions up on YouTube pretty quickly after the events, and all our previous talks are on YouTube. So if you ask a question, be grateful if you could come to the mic in the center of the room. And if you feel like introducing yourself, we'd love you to do that as well. I know you've asked all your questions. Well, I have a question just to lead off. You did talk a little bit about some of the alternative publication approaches, and we see that in physics and in economics and a few other disciplines, we're seeing this long tradition of preprints going into the networked environment and having made that transition very securely. Can you imagine, for example, in some of your disciplines, seeing that sort of really major transition to pre-publication, preprint publication, and then the sort of endorsement that follows heavy citation use and so on?
Well, I will speak to basic, and there was an experiment done by Nature,
Yeah.
you may know, where they they let people opt into almost an open review system where at the time, it's not quite the preprint thing, but saying, okay, you first submit, everyone can see it, right, and comment on it. Very, very few people were willing to do this. There is a sense within basic research that we've moved further and further away from openly communicating what we're doing, both in terms of posting preprints or even speaking at scientific at conferences. There's getting more and more of this feel that I'll only speak about it once it's in press. Mm-hmm. And it's really a shame from my perspective, but there's so much fear in a world in which the experiments themselves are pretty easy to do. There's equipment, there's stuff you can just buy. Once you know what the result is, it's pretty easy to reproduce it. Within a lot of modern molecular biology, at least, that it's much different than physics. Any kind of, you need to make the equipment to do the experiment, and the idea that somebody can go off and just repeat it quickly is it's dramatically different. So I wish I could say yes, but I'm not with the competition as we have it today, not in basic biology.
And I think what our experience has been is that there's a lot of apprehension on the part of authors as to whether journals will then treat those submissions in the same way that they would something that hadn't appeared anywhere. And we get lots of questions from authors about whether something can appear as a technical report, whether it can appear in their institutional repository. Does that preclude publication? What does that mean? And it's not that we have a policy which precludes it, but the apprehension is already out there, and people are self-censoring.
And I would think, again, I think the timing issue is not as enhanced in some of our social science journals. But I also think it would have, the experiment would have to be conducted with post-tenure, more senior and veteran researchers who didn't necessarily feel that their future essentially, and perhaps many do, but that their future relies on the success of this relative experiment. But I think for pre-tenured faculty who are trying to build a CV, it would be too much of a risk, so maybe small experiments could work.
But I want to say one other thing. There is a kind of experiment going on called Open Network, Open Notebook Science. Is that what it's called? And there is a completely diametrically opposed view, which is I want to work on projects where I can collaborate. I'm sick of this. I have to keep it secret until it's in press. I believe research is better done in an open environment, and there are some people who have moved in that direction, have chosen their projects for those kinds of collaborations, and have done so, quite successfully. So I think there are pockets of exceptions there, and that if you're committed to having open collaboration, you can succeed in biology and biochemistry and chemistry too. I don't think I don't think it's the nature of the beast. I used to say when I was a student that you had two options. One was to be open with everyone, and then there was some community standard that would say, hey, this person's been working on this for 10 years. What happened? Who's this person? Right? So you're open with everyone, or you become very private. And I think that polarization, I think, is happening even in the fields that I know.
Any other questions, comments?
Microphone.
We want you on record this time.
So going back to when you had the statistics about
the time it takes for something to become published, it's kind of counterintuitive that when things move electronically, it actually doubled the time it takes to get from submission to acceptance. Do you know why?
So that's, I mean, the puzzle is why. I mean, those are data, and certainly my point was that you'd think, if anything, if everything were the same, it would be faster, and it's not faster, so something has changed. Whether it's that papers have gotten more complicated, so you need lots of different experts, and that is certainly true that we've moved in biology from having 2 reviewers to, in some of these complicated papers, having 3 or 4 or 5 reviewers on a single paper. You get them all in, you know, it all takes, you know, it's a harder thing to orchestrate. I think reviewing has changed. That's what I think, you know, my own sense of it.
Yeah, sometimes I feel like I have to wait for a long time for certain reviewers to get back to me with my paper. So there's not a deadline for reviewers.
There is often a deadline for reviewers, but the, so it depends on the field. So in ecology or social science, it might be 3 to 6 months. In journals that have different fields oriented, in Cell, we expected in 2 weeks. You know, there are some that say, you know, 3 to 6 weeks. I mean, sort of, people ask those things of reviewers. The problem is reviewers say, yes, I can do this. What do you do when they don't deliver? So one of the proposals has been, send the paper out to more reviewers than you need, expecting that some subset just won't deliver, and work with the ones you get. Now that might work, but given that we have multidisciplinary, at least in the fields I work in, you have these kind of multidisciplinary papers, you can't get the, you know, replace the person who really understands this aspect of the paper with just some random other person. You have to have this kind of Chinese menu that says, okay, within everything I want, I need multiple people just anticipating that people won't come through. Now, reviewer scoring does help, right? So it's one of the things that we keep track of, all of us do who work as editors. You know, do they actually deliver when they say they will? And then you have the next problem for basic research where you can do experimental revision. Quite often you'll want to send the paper back to those reviewers, and they may have had time to do it quickly the first time around, but you can't just shift the reviewers the second time. They may be writing their own grant or doing something else that now the time becomes enormous because they don't have an opportunity to opt out this time. You sort of need them to look at the revision. So there are a couple of reasons for that.
So it sounds like there's no advantage to be a reviewer. I mean, is there some sort of incentive for reviewers? I mean, it's just, I don't know.
I think, yeah, no, I think what I was trying to say earlier was that I do think there's an advantage. I think there's an advantage certainly across your career life cycle, but particularly as junior faculty to begin to be introduced to the new pieces that are coming in and see what people are writing about. And so is there an advantage? It's the community service, and it's being part of the group that's actually shaping what it is that's being selected and how it's being shaped. But no, there's no incentive. I mean, there's no financial. There's a bit of a benefit to put it on your CV that you're either an ad hoc or a regular reviewer for a particular journal.
I think the value of being a reviewer is greatest when the paper is well matched to your, you know, area of expertise, because then it's something that will impact your work or could impact your work. And that's just hard to do. I think getting to your other point about the time period, I think that the major thing that electronic submission has done is simply taken away the post office as the excuse for the delay. But it's done 2 other things, at least as far as I can tell. Number one, in many cases it's made the submission process easier, which means that the volume of submissions increases, and not necessarily in response to that are journals able to actually increase their editorial staff. And then I remember the first time I got a request to review something electronically. Well, that first one I was really fast in getting back to. But when I figured out that my email box could quickly get filled with requests from editors electronically asking me to review, then it slowed right down again. So I think people are getting asked to do more reviews. I think people are submitting to more places. And of course, if we simply speeded up the process, right, that would make it even worse, because the same paper would then be cycled through multiple times until it hits. So I don't think there is a great answer to that question. I mean, I think we've all tried to expand, where we can, expand reviewer pools, but it's really tough to get exactly the kind of people that you want.
Yeah, so one of the things people have talked about uncoupling the assessment of a paper in terms of its methodology and its potential importance from whether it belongs in a particular journal is that it can enable those reviews to be used at multiple journals. And so you just said kind of inherently, well, obviously, if it goes through multiple journals, you're going to use reviewers more and more times. If we could undo that somehow by having the review be fungible, then I think we could speed up the process, even if you use journals. And so the neuroscience is experimenting with that. There are a bunch of journals that have agreed to do it. Not that many people are opting in for whatever reason, but it is something that I've puzzled with. And I know that when I was at Cell Press, we used to allow people to submit to multiple journals at the same time. And our own anecdotal experience with that has been that reviewers tend not to, if you ask them about advice for the journal, they tend not to give that advice equally when they're doing multiple journals at once. So they might say, there's no way this is a Cell paper, sure, you can publish it in Neuron. But if you'd sent it directly from Neuron, the Neuron editor would argue they wouldn't have said the same thing. And so that's why I think you really need to pull the advice piece completely out from what the reviewers are doing, and then maybe you can enable movement.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm from neurology and epidemiology, and I wanted to thank you for the thought-provoking presentations. And I had a few questions, but maybe I'll just start with one, which is what you think of the notion of charging authors to publish their papers. And that obviously raises a lot of issues for the authors, and having conceived of the idea of starting my own journal and having that as a model, definitely I sort of brush up against different opinions. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are.
Coming from the open access world, I'm a believer in charging pre-publication charges. Now, where that money comes from is an issue we've talked about a lot. Authors, at least in basic science, are charged already quite a bit to publish their papers, even if they're subscription-based journals. They're charged for corrections, they're charged for color, they're charged for number of pages. I mean, it's kind of historically, authors have had author-side charges, and society journals historically have used both author-side charges and reader-side charges to fund publication. Now, the problem comes with author-side charges are the two questions that get raised about that are, will that influence reviewing or decision-making about what to publish? So if you're charging from the author side, won't you just be pushed to publish everything? That's like asking Columbia, if you're charging tuition, won't you just accept everyone into Columbia because you'll get more tuition that way? You know, sort of, I think it's an inherently flawed worry, but people do have it. One of the things we did at PLoS to get around that was that people wouldn't know who could pay and who couldn't pay when they were looking at papers, and I think that's an important thing to create an information barrier about charges from that side, because I do think publishers will get invested in what they publish. Then the other side is when you have options to go to a journal that doesn't charge versus a journal that does charge, the issue comes, there are three things that will come. There's the issue of can you afford it, and are there waivers if you can't? There's the issue of if you choose to publish, will that keep you from doing something else that's research-oriented? I think are two of the issues that authors need to face, which can be troubling. This is a very long answer. I think you need to create ways to create for waivers for people who can't pay. We did that at PLoS. And you know, when we audited it, it seemed the people who were saying they couldn't pay really couldn't pay, you know, in some sense. We didn't ask for financials, but for the most part, people didn't manipulate the system too much. I think that pocket has to be separable from research funds. I think it's really hard to ask people to make the decision between publishing this paper or doing the next piece of work. And I think there have been lots of work around how to do that. So that's my kind of view about it. I don't think there's anything inherently bad about author-side charges, but I do think there are issues, conflict issues that need to be sort of tackled head on.
I think, this is probably not the most popular perspective, but I think it's probably worth noting that wherever the funds come from to put the journal together is probably going to influence the nature of the communication. And one of the concerns I have, is it's a mild concern, but a concern is that as we move away from having journals supported by readers, it's very likely that the nature of the communication will become different. And if it's only a journal for authors, to satisfy authors, and if it's supported by authors, that may, whether that's good or bad is an open question, but I think it's going to be different than if it's actually supported by end consumers and by readers. And I think one of the problems that all of the disciplines have is a real underinvestment in communicating with outside publics and demonstrating the value of the work. So I would be concerned on that ground.
Yeah, and I would echo that concern. I think that's definitely true for us.
I completely agree with that in principle. My problem with that with respect to kind of the role that what the reader side charge really is. I mean, so most of our reader side charges are it's the librarian who's paying that bill, right? It's not the reader of the journal article. And so what I have felt, certainly my own perspective about the reader, what we had as reader side charges is, in fact, neither the author nor the reader was paying. It was the library that was paying. And so it created a really kind of inelasticity and no correlation. Anyone who's done the study, there isn't a correlation between price and value. If you perceive value as the quality of the work, the number of people who read it, in the 5 or 10 years ago, at least, in any case, when I last looked this up, there seemed to be an inverse correlation. The journals that had the smallest readerships were the much more niche-like journals that, they had really huge charges because only a handful of librarians were paying for them, and therefore they had to cover the whole cost. Whereas journals like Nature, or Science, which has 180,000 subscribers or something like that, they could bring those costs way down for any individual user. And so one of the things I've always liked about the author side charge is that at least you see something about cost connected to quality, in some sense that you actually see the cost even if you don't pay the cost, whereas the library, that's my counter side. But I do agree with the whole issue of a larger readership than the ones we tend to think about, in which the authors and the readers are essentially the same people over time in kind of niche publishing anyway.
The second question that I have relates to impact factor, which, I mean, some of the sort of trends that are going on right now make me think that something that I thought was sort of bogus to begin with is even more bogus. And I'll give you some examples. I think a lot of journals are just trying to publish reviews because that's a way to get their impact factor up. And at least in the clinical journals, those reviews aren't very good. They're not of particularly high quality, and they're not reporting on new results. They're not particularly synthesizing anything in any particularly useful way. So I'm really wary of that. And then the other is that, I've had journals say, we'll take as an author, we'll take your paper, but please cite the following papers in this journal, just to boost their own impact factor. And then, I get these emails, almost one a week now from journals that I subscribe to or, that I review for or whatever to say, our impact factor is up from 2.1 to 3. And it seems like every journal's impact factor is going up because of these tendencies. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about impact factor. So I have a friend, Richard Sever, who is at Cold Spring Harbor Press now, and he was hired by the Journal of Cell Science many years ago when he went to raise the impact factor of Journal of Cell Science. I'm telling his story. He didn't handle the research at all. What he did was he invited big-name people to write reviews for the front of the journal. And the impact factor doubled at Journal of Cell Science from, I think it was, I don't remember, 3 to 6, let's say. I'm just making the numbers up. What really puzzled Richard and me was that the editorial board saw this new impact factor and said, yeah, I've noticed that the research papers are getting better in the Journal of Cell Science. There's some interesting phenomenon. When people see an impact factor, they look at the papers in a different way. And that really troubles me. That was kind of my impact factor thought. We are definitely moved. But I want to raise a couple things. You said that they are bogus numbers. So anyone notice that Acta Crystallographica has a higher impact factor than the New England Journal of Medicine this year? The reason is they published a review. It was a review of a bit of software, protein folding software. And within the review said, you know, if you're using the software, this would be a really good citation to use because it's published and it tells you about the software and you don't have, you know, manuals aren't in PubMed, so it becomes a citable reference. It got cited 6,000 times. So there it was, one paper. There's a cancer reviews journal that every year or every 2 years publishes cancer epidemiology statistics for the U.S. Those reviews get cited by everyone who's working on those cancers for the next 2 years. So they always have an impact factor higher than the New England Journal. So yes, there are ways to game the system. I think anytime you tell people to work to a number, they will figure out a way to work to that number. And that's, I don't think that's a problem with any metric, actually. But impact factor is particularly troubling because it's not the metric you think it is, right? What sits in the numerator is not what you think sits there.
Do you have one more question? Yeah, I think we have time for one more question.
So from the answer you gave him about the authors paying the journals and also the library paying the journals for subscriptions, so journals are getting double the pay, is that right?
No, I think what you'd say with anything is that you have a mixed revenue model, right? So you look, I mean, many healthy economies will say we want to pick up, we want to mix our revenues so that we aren't sensitive. We're not going to be sensitive to any one thing dropping. The difference between an author pays model and a library pays model is the difference between having all your money. So a library will pay a subscription at the beginning of the year, and you have all that money for the year. Author pays side is almost like a retail business, right? Every time you publish a paper, you put out a charge. It's actually much harder to get these small payments through than it is to get these big, large payments. So it's sort of a whole different business dynamic that happens there in the author side. But it's not a double pay. It's sort of a way of distributing the charge. Now, you do speak to a kind of, there are a set of journals, and one of the journals I worked on was until this coming year has been among them, a number of journals that have moved towards hybrid models, where they've said, we're basically a subscription journal, but you can opt in to having your journal be your article being freely available from the day of publication, and for that you pay a supplementary fee, author side fee. And there people have worried about the double charge. The library still pays the full subscription, and now for these papers, you're paying extra on top of that to have this 6-month window or whatever it is where things are free when they wouldn't otherwise be. There are librarians in the audience who can speak to this better than I do, but I do know there have been some attempts on the parts of some publishers to be transparent about what they're charging and how those charges change as more and more people will take up this kind of open access option. But the double dipping has been a real concern, as they call it.
Well, please join me in thanking our 3 speakers. This has been really interesting, I think.